Someone who can no longer take care of themselves? Are you overwhelmed? This is Caregiver Solutions Info with Marcia Teal. Marcia will be hosting an hour of true stories and information, tips and updates of the latest research and necessary information in the caregiving field, focusing on you, the family caregiver. An Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert, Marcia has 15 years of hands-on experience at Arden Courts, a leader in assisted living dementia communities here in the U.S. Marcia covers everything you need to know as a family caregiver, especially if you care for a loved one with Alzheimer's disease or other related dementia or chronic illness. If you have a friend or relative that is also a family caregiver, call them now. They won't want to miss a minute. And let them know they can watch on caregiversolutions.info. And they can listen on WNN 1470 AM in South Florida or nationally on the iHeartRadio app. Now, sit back, relax, and learn from our host, Marcia Teal, as she brings information to you that may just be the caregiving solution you need.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Caregiver Solution Info Show. I'm so glad you could join us today. We have another wonderful program. We're still dealing with the pandemic, and I know a lot of caregivers out there, even before the pandemic, have problems trying to figure out when's the right time, if and when, that they should or need to place a loved one in a memory care community. It's not a very easy thing for caregivers sometimes to figure out because they're in the trenches and sometimes they don't really see the actual situation. We're going to talk about that today. We're also going to talk to a professional caregiver advisor. We're also going to be talking to her as a family member. So she's going to share with us what she's learned through caregiving for her dad, what she has learned through all her years of helping families and advising families on different aspects of caregiving. Also, we're going to be talking about resources for caregivers and how to reduce caregiver stress. So all of that and more today on this week's Caregiver Solution Info Show. So joining me live to do all of that is Kay Sullivan. Kay Sullivan is joining me from her home office in Pennsylvania. Kay has recently retired from an Arden Courts in Maryland, where she was memory care advisor for 13 years, helping thousands of families in difficult situations. Prior to that, Kay worked in a skilled nursing facility doing assessments and admissions and helping families there as well. She is also a dementia care practitioner, and as I mentioned before, she is a family caregiver, caring and overseeing care for her father. So I'm so excited to welcome to the show tonight via telephone with her beautiful picture up on the screen in case you are watching us live stream on the Caregiver Information Caregiver Show website, or you might be just listening on your computer or on the iHeartRadio app. Anyway, whichever it is, I'm glad you're here. So I want to say hello, Kay. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you for reaching out to me.
Well, I've known you for the whole 13 years that you worked as a memory care advisor for couple of the Arden Courts, actually up in the Maryland area, and you recently retired, so congratulations on your retirement. But I know you, and you are that kind of person who has a heart for what you do. You certainly have the experience and the expertise helping families, especially families dealing with dementia issues for their loved one. You're in the trenches yourself as a family caregiver, so you bring a lot to this discussion. And I want to thank you for agreeing to be here and talking about all of that, because sometimes it's not easy talking about our own family situation and our personal trials and tribulations. So thank you so much for being here. I'm excited that you're here. So, Kay, one of the things that I mentioned in the beginning of the show, families sometimes have difficulty figuring out if and when to get help for their loved one, meaning put that person, move them into a memory care community. And so they have a lot of excuses sometimes because they don't know when to do it, and they think in their mind, they have a certain target in mind. But then the pandemic, the COVID pandemic comes along. And I think that just threw everybody for a loop. It gave another reason or excuse, whichever the case may be, to again delay moving a loved one into a memory care community. So I'd like to talk with you a little bit about that, your experience helping families making that right decision, and then relative to the COVID-19, what are the positives and negatives of waiting too long? So, Kay, what do you see with caregivers in general as far as needing to have that help and not really understanding when to get it? What's your experience?
I can tell you that for the most part, whoever the main caregiver is, they always wait too long. And I think there's a lot of guilt involved in this decision-making process. But I always tell my families when they first reach out to me, I always say that, the guilt piece of making this decision is normal. Everybody feels the guilt piece of it. But you kind of have to kind of split your way of thinking into the logical side of this decision-making process and the emotional side. And let's add the pandemic in on top of that, and that makes it 10 times as hard because it's scary. The majority of us haven't experienced a pandemic in decades. So, what families, if you're a caregiver for somebody and you're checking up on them, let's say at the most maybe every 2 weeks, and you start seeing those little signs when you go in and you visit. You're starting to see that, maybe the food in the refrigerator isn't being eaten, or maybe the bills are laying on the table and they're not getting paid appropriately, or maybe they're not showering as often as they should, or even, maybe you get, maybe when you go to visit, you check in with a neighbor and the neighbor says, just want to let you know, I saw your mother outside to get the mail the other day, and she wasn't really dressed properly when she went out, and there was, 1.5 feet of snow, and it was very cold. Those are all those big flashing, yellow lights that are telling you something's not right. And that should be a trigger for you to really start thinking about, I really need to start looking. I really need to start doing my homework. Because when you wait too long, things can happen. Things can happen at home. And maybe that person's living by themselves, or maybe that person might be living with the caregiver right now, but it has been a most recent move because you thought, okay, mom can move in with me and I'll just take care of her. Well, it takes a good 20-plus people in a 24-hour day to provide proper care to somebody. And let me explain what that means. It means that the main caregiver is the cook, is the grocery shopper, is the person that pays the bills, the person that takes them to the doctor's office, the person that picks up the medication, the person that helps them take a shower, the person that tries to keep them occupied. You're the chief cook, bottle washer, and if you're doing that 24/7, when do you have time to take care of yourself? So with that said, that really is the time when you really need to start to look. You need to start really doing your homework and really start to educate yourself.
But with the pandemic, people are saying, well, maybe I was ready before the pandemic hit, but I hear all these stories and I'm not feeling really safe putting my loved one in a memory care because I know, I can't see them that often. Maybe there's a lot of restrictions to visiting. There's a lot of unknowns regarding the pandemic. How do I know that, it's going to be safe? So this is what they're dealing with. But if someone keeps putting the decision on the back burner because they're maybe waiting for this pandemic to be all clear, and we don't know really when that's going to be, then there's going to be consequences. So, let's talk a little bit about these consequences, because honestly, Kay, when I was thinking about the positive and negative, I could only think of really no positive reasons to really wait. And there were lots of negative reasons, and I thought of actually a positive reason for actually going to a memory care during the pandemic, and that one was so that you could probably have your loved one get their COVID vaccine earlier, because most states were vaccinating the elderly in assisted living facilities and nursing homes. So if your loved one went into a community or a facility prior to the vaccine coming in and being administered to the residents and the staff, then they could go ahead and get that, and that would be a good thing, because then they would be ahead of it and not being home and figuring out when they could get it. So that's actually a reason to go ahead and move in, get the COVID vaccine, and then get ahead of that. But there's a few other consequences, though, of not moving in and of waiting too long. And the first one I want to talk about, yeah, I mean, you've seen it, but what happens when a person does stay home too long? What's the consequence of waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally maybe they say, I can't wait any longer, COVID-19 or not, now I'm ready to come. What could be a consequence of waiting till then?
Well, their health can absolutely decline, especially with social isolation. With the pandemic, everybody is, for the most part, socially isolated. But with somebody that has a form of memory loss and they're isolated within a home and they can't get outside and they don't get that stimulation from other people, they're going to decline. I mean, it's statistically proven that if the brain doesn't get stimulation, even in somebody who doesn't have dementia, but it is, 20 times more likely for somebody to decline more rapidly cognitively for somebody who's isolated. So in an assisted living, or they have activities and they have a lot of socialization going on. I mean, they're socializing, 6 feet apart, and they're having small groups gatherings, but for the most part, what you need to focus on is what's going to keep them cognitively stimulated. And being at home, for the most part, isn't going to do it. Plus that, a lot of things can happen at home. They could fall, they could have an accident, they could wander away from home, especially if, it's happened. It happens all the time. 60% of people who have a form of memory loss or Alzheimer's will possibly attempt to wander away from home. And the main caregiver has to sleep at some point in time. So, that's always a possibility. But the social isolation right now, that really would be at the top of the list. And just having somebody who has cognitive impairment and memory problems sitting in front of a television all day long, and that being their social stimulation, that's really a recipe for, I think, disaster and mental decline.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And let's say that someone waits, but yet they were accepted and they went ahead and placed, but they waited a really long time. Sometimes the person has declined so much that they can't take advantage of all of those things that you mentioned with the stimulation and the socialization, because they've declined so far down or progressed into the dementia so much that they're not really benefiting a lot from the environment because they've waited too long to come. And so again, like you said, it's been shown through studies that the sooner someone gets into a memory care for that support and they start getting acclimated and start participating, then they're going to really benefit. So people can actually go, but they might not really get the whole advantage of it. What do you say about that?
It's very possible that they could, when they actually make that decision, and if they've waited too long, when they go into an assisted living, there's an assessment that has to be done. And it's very possible that their loved one could assess at a higher level of care, meaning they just totally skip over the assisted living piece of it and go right into nursing home care or long-term care.
So that's a consequence of waiting too long, because your loved one might not even qualify by the time you say, okay, I'll do it. I'll finally get the help that I need and my loved one needs. They may not qualify per the state, wherever state they live in, guidelines, rules, regulations, and they aren't appropriate to move into a memory care community, which then, like you said, the only alternative is to go back home or go into a long-term setting like a skilled nursing home for custodial care. And so really, I think caregivers really need to understand that, because there are dire consequences to waiting, because if you don't want your loved one in a memory care community right now or later, you certainly don't want to be forced to have them go into a nursing home long term, because one is like living in a hospital and one is more like home. So there are huge consequences, and I just wanted to bring that up, because it's not just the pandemic that's causing this. There are other reasons that families wait too long, but these consequences apply to whatever reason that the families are waiting. So I want to thank you for sharing all of that, because it's really, really important. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more from Kay Sullivan, Memory Care Advisor. We'll be right back.
Arden Courts is not just a place to live, it's a place to call home. Residential living combined with quality caregiving. This is the philosophy behind Arden Courts. Communities created exclusively for individuals with Alzheimer's disease and related dementia who would benefit from a safe and structured environment. For additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides, call 888-478-2410 to locate a community nearest you. Inquire about our educational seminars, resource library, or support groups, or simply feel free to ask questions you may have about Alzheimer's and related dementias. At Arden Courts, we know, we understand, and we can help, because memory care is all we do. Remember, call 888-478-2410 for additional information about any of the unique services Arden Courts provides. You are listening to your host, Marcia Teal, an Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert on caregiversolutions.info. If you have a question or wish to share a story, call into the show at 888-565-1470 and talk with Marcia. Now, back to Caregiver Solutions.
I'm talking with Kay Sullivan from Pennsylvania. Kay is just retired from being a memory care advisor over 13 years with an Arden Courts up in Maryland. She's also a dementia care practitioner and a family caregiver. So, Kay, we're talking about reasons caregivers shouldn't wait too long before moving into a memory care community for their loved one. We talked about some of the consequences, but another one I want to bring up before we go on to our next subject is the stress that the caregivers are under the longer that they wait. Talk a little bit about what caregivers go through and why don't they recognize their stress?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, that caregivers, especially spouses, statistically, when a spouse as a caregiver is providing care to somebody that has a diagnosis of some form of memory loss, that is a lot of stress on them. And statistically, sometimes that caregiver, sometimes their length of quality of life is a lot less than what the person with the actual diagnosis is. But what caregivers go through is, like I said, it takes, 20 plus people in the course of a 24-hour day to provide care to somebody that, has memory loss. But they oftentimes don't think about themselves. What happens if something happens to them medically, physically, and then they can't take care of the person who has the diagnosis? That, again, is a recipe for disaster, because not only do you have one person that needs help, you have a second person that needs help. So you kind of have to have your kind of ducks in a row, so to speak. But what a lot of caregivers do is, they like to have things in control. They like to think that they can control it all 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that literally is impossible. I've seen it a lot with families where they wait too long, and it's always the main caregiver that comes in, and then maybe it's the son and daughter that have to step in an emergency and kind of disrupt their lives to help out, the spouse, because now they have both, mother and father or parent who now they both need help. So, again, that's something that, I think you need to be able to think future-wise. What happens if something happens to me? And we see it all the time where the health of the caregiver just significantly declines.
Well, I think you definitely got that right. But a lot of caregivers, like you said, they feel like they are the only ones that can control the situation, or they're the only ones that can know what to do, and so they do have that desire to control the whole scenario. But what do you say to a caregiver when they tell you, well, no one's going to take care of my husband the way I do. No one knows him like I do. I can't give that up. What's going on there, Kay?
Well, when a caregiver says that, that in itself has a lot to do with the guilt piece of it. And and I always tell them, I said, I always try to get them to think logically. If we're never going to replace them, and that's what they think will happen, we're never going to replace them when it comes to, being the spouse. But from a standpoint of 24-hour round-the-clock care, and especially nursing care, I always try to get them to think logically. Like, you can't do all this yourself. Your loved one will never stop loving you. You will always be the spouse, and you will always be involved in this care process. And that's because every assisted living gets the information directly from you. You'll give us all that information. We'll put it together in a care plan, and then that's how the care is provided in the assisted living.
Yeah, they have to trust, that things are going to get done, and maybe not exactly the way they would do it every time, but trust that it will get done. And that's, again, one of the consequences of waiting too long, because it may not end up getting done by the people that you want it to be done by, because either the caregiver is going to decline and not be able to do it, or the person's going to end up, in a place that maybe you didn't desire. I can't tell you how sad it is when I've had to go to the bedside of a caregiver, a spouse, to finally have them agree and sign the agreement to move their loved one into a memory care community, because they were the ones, because of stress, that ended up in the hospital. So, the caregivers, they just don't see that. They think they can do it. They try really, really hard. And they don't understand, I don't think, like others see them, what they're putting themselves through. So they need to give themselves a break and see, like you said, think logically and do what they need to do to relieve that stress, which we're going to talk about at the end of the show, how caregivers can more be able to relieve that stress prior to going into a memory care community. So a lot to talk about, Kay. You've been there, you've seen it, you've done it all. When we come back from our next commercial break, I want to talk to you about your caregiving experiences, what you're doing as a family caregiver, and that is something that's going to really resonate with a lot of people. You've been in the trenches, you walk the walk, not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. So we're going to go to commercial break, at which time we're going to give away a free gift to anyone who's watching or listening. So be right back and stay with us.
Arden Court's Memory Care Community has the expertise and experience to simplify and enhance your loved one's life and to protect you, finding the peace of mind you deserve. Come, see the difference in a facility like Arden Courts that is 100% dedicated to Alzheimer's and dementia care can have on your loved one. Call us at 888-478-2410 or visit our website, arden-courts.com. You are listening to your host, Marcia Teal, an Alzheimer's disease and dementia care expert on caregiversolutions.info. If you have a question or wish to share a story, call into the show at 888-565-1470 and talk with Marcia. Now, back to Caregiver Solutions.
Back. At this time, I'd like to thank our national sponsor for this program, Arden Courts Memory Care Community. Arden Courts has about 50 memory care communities all across the United States, 10 of them here in Florida. Arden Courts is a leader in memory care, and as such, they provide lots of resources for caregivers, from support groups and seminars, and even now online seminars because of COVID-19. Today, because you are part of this program, they're offering you this free book. It's called The 36-Hour Day. It's a wonderful resource for caregivers, written by Dr. Peter Rabins and Nancy Mace. And this is a book that you can really get great information from, some tips, some information on different dementias, what to do in certain situations. You can read it front to back, or you can pick and choose as you need the information. So this book is absolutely free just because you're watching and listening to this program. And the way you can get this book is just send an email with your name, address, and phone number to delray@arden-courts.com. That email address again is delray, DELRAY, at arden-courts.com. If you don't have access to a computer and you'd rather call for the book, you can do that too at 888-478-2410. Tell them that you heard about the free offer of the 36-hour day on the Caregiver Solution Info Show, and they'll be happy to get your name, address, and telephone number and send a book right to you. So if you don't have this, I highly recommend getting it. It's a wonderful resource. So today, my special guest is Kay Sullivan. Kay is a dementia care practitioner. She's also been a memory advisor for memory care assisted living in Maryland for the past 13 years. And she's also a family caregiver. So thank you, Kay, for joining us. It's a pleasure to talk with you again. You've been a wonderful resource for many, many families throughout your years, helping them. And your expertise and knowledge with dementia care is really appreciated. So you told me that you were a caregiver for your dad. So if you wouldn't mind, I was hoping that you could share with us how you became a caregiver for your dad, or why you became a caregiver for your dad, and the situation and what you do for him. Could you mind doing that for us?
Sure. So my father is a Korean War veteran. He's 92 years old, and currently he lives in a personal care home in Pennsylvania, not far from where I live. And so just to go back a little bit, my mother and father were married for 65 years. And
wow.
My mother was a registered nurse, and my father was a mechanic. But the interesting part about my dad is that my dad basically was deaf from the time he was about 9 years old. So he lost his hearing because back then he had he caught a virus, and he wasn't treated properly. So because of that, he wasn't hospitalized. He did lose quite a bit of his hearing when he was 9 years old. Never learned sign language, and he basically went to school but dropped out in the 9th grade because back then, in those days, you know, he came from a family background where they didn't have the money to buy a hearing aid, and he just dropped out of school, 9th grade education, and just worked for the rest of his life. So when he was drafted and went in the Korean War, when he got out, he met my mother. And my mother was a registered nurse. And, of course, registered nurses love to be caregivers. So she, believe it or not, on their honeymoon, she actually took him to the VA and got him his first hearing aid. And that's really the rest of the story until about 3 years ago when my mother passed away. And,
sorry.
Of course, they lived together in a tiny little town, and she was my father's, how can I put this, buffer to the outside world, because he really did not socialize a lot. He couldn't carry on conversations. He did jobs the best he possibly could, but there was always that deficit because he couldn't hear what people were saying to him. And believe me, that in a lot of cases can be very, very dangerous. So she was kind of like his tape recorder. She was the person that, you know, was always there at his side whenever there was somebody else around. She was interpreting. She would literally repeat everything that was being said to him, because he was very good at watching somebody, reading their lips, but he couldn't hear the spoken word. All he could hear is tone. So my mother really was his main caregiver. And so she did all the cooking and the cleaning and the bill paying, and she had a full-time job all on top of that. So when she got sick, and that was about maybe 5 years ago, I saw the writing on the wall. And, you know, being in the business that I'm in, I approached them many, many, many times and said, you know, it really is time that you think about, you know, moving out of this house because it's starting to get way too much for the both of you, and moving closer to me so I can be here when you need me. Well, that went over like a lead balloon. No, we're not doing that. And, you know, unfortunately, you can't force somebody to do something that they don't want to do, because remember, neither one of them had any memory impairment at the time. So, and typically for seniors, couples like that, you know, they keep everything close to the vest. They don't want to share what's happening. They don't want to. And by the way, I lived 350 miles away, and I had a full-time job, so I wasn't seeing them all the time. I could only call on the phone and get as much information as I could. And believe me, you don't get the full story unless you're right there and you actually visually see what's going on.
Yeah, you're right.
So with that said, my mother's heart condition got worse and worse and worse. And she ended up going into the hospital a couple of times, but always got back up on her feet and ended up coming home. Well, eventually it just got to the point where she just wasn't healthy anymore. And she was, again, keeping everything close to the vest. Whenever anybody tried to, you know, say, okay, I'm coming up, I'm going to take care of you. No, she didn't want that to happen. She didn't want the neighbors to help. She stopped going to church. She stopped baking. She stopped doing a lot of things that she was doing. And then one day it happened. You know, she fell at home and hit her head. She fell in the bathroom, hit her head in the tub, was life-flighted to a hospital. And that's when I stepped in and took over. And she never did go back home. It was 6 months after that she passed away. But during that time, I made immediate arrangements. I let no grass grow under my feet. I immediately brought them both to me as close as I could and got her into a skilled rehabilitation facility. And she was there for about 6 weeks. And during that time, I took that opportunity to find a place for both of them to move into. And they moved in, and a week later, my mother declined significantly. And she ended up going immediately into hospice. But my father doing all this relied 100% on me to do everything. I took over as his interpreter. I took my mother's place for my father. And it was at that time that I realized, wow, even when you're in the business in the healthcare business and doing what I do, until you actually walk in the shoes of the spouse or the caregiver, it all makes total sense. Now I understand why my mother was the spouse that went first. The care that is required to take care of a deaf man. Now, my father, God bless him, he does not have dementia. He has mild cognitive impairment. But what's required to be his tape recorder and to interpret everything in the world back to him, it's unbelievable. I now realize how much of a buffer my mother was for my father. She kept the world at bay. And the reason I'm telling you all this is because this is exactly what caregivers do. They are a buffer. They build this big fence up, and they just don't want to let the rest of the world in. They don't want that extra help. And if my mother would have actually stepped back and said, I need help, I need somebody to step in and help me, I truly believe that my mother would have been with us today. Just a little bit longer, for sure. The stress that's involved in taking care of a deaf man, because he doesn't understand anything that's being said to him. It all has to be written down in black and white and explained to him in very simple terms.
So you were actually thrown into this role because of a crisis that happened, and I think that's a great example of a lot of families that they get thrown into caregiving during a crisis because they're not accepting help or getting help, and all of a sudden now they're in a crisis situation, so they have no choice. So I think a lot of people, could relate to your story for sure. But your father reads lips, so that's an advantage, I guess, at least for him, except for now the pandemic is here. What did that do to him?
Well, now his world is basically kind of confined to his little apartment that he lives in. And, I don't feel guilty about that because he is well taken care of. He has all the amenities that he needs. And what's interesting about this is that, when you have somebody who is the interpreter for somebody else and really is that buffer and does everything for them from a social standpoint, they start to rely on them so much. It's almost like they're an enabler. They don't allow that real person to come through. Well, what I learned about my dad was that, my dad has this great personality that my mother was always that buffer between him and everybody else. And I learned that, my dad has this great sense of humor, and he can actually cook for himself, and he can actually wash his own clothes. And, he
Wow.
can make his own bed, and he can take his own medication and those types of things. Whereas when my mother was there, she never allowed any of that because she was the person who wanted to be in control. And she was that caregiver, and that was her total, in her mind, that's what gave her purpose.
Wow. That's really something. So your dad has to wear a mask and everybody else has to wear a mask. So if and when you're not there and he has interaction with staff at the care home or other residents, that must be really hard for him because everybody's wearing a mask and now he can't read lips. How does he cope?
It was extremely hard for him. In fact, at certain points in time during this pandemic up to this point, he got pretty angry. He would, when they told him he had to wear a mask, he would rip it off and he would say, I'm not doing this because I can't understand what that person is saying. And
Right.
it's just like with a person who's deaf, they tend to hear tones, they tend to read lips. Even, for example, even for somebody, and you can apply this to dementia too, for somebody who has a beard or a mustache, a deaf person, it's very hard for them to read somebody's lips. Even with somebody who has dementia, when somebody has a beard and a mustache, it's hard for them to interpret, what they're saying because all they're seeing is just the movement of this hair on somebody's face and a mustache moving. I mean, you don't think about those things until somebody actually tells you that. And my father would always say to me, I'm not talking to that person because I can't read their lips. That person has a mustache and a beard, and all I see is a bunch of hair moving back and forth. And it would actually agitate him. But a mask, absolutely. He began to socially isolate himself more because other people were wearing masks.
I can totally understand that. So when someone did need to communicate with him, they had to use different techniques. And do you think there are similarities with communication? I mean, this mustache beard thing is an excellent example because who would have really realized that? But are there other techniques of communication that might be similar since you know the dementia world and now you know your dad in the deaf world? Are there any other similarities that you could think of that would help caregivers to understand better how to relate to their loved one in this circumstances?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I even experienced one this weekend that I had to pull somebody aside and give them an example of what to do and what not to do. So the environment itself for somebody who has hearing impairment or even somebody with dementia, the sound that's going on around you when you're having a conversation with that person impairs their ability to understand what's being said to them. So you want to make sure that when you are in an environment that it's quiet, you don't have any background noise like the television's on or the radio's playing, or maybe you're outside and the cars are driving by down the road, or the telephone's ringing, or there's kids, running around having a good time, kids being kids, but that's all a distraction in that environment. So take my dad, for instance. He has to be in an environment to actually have a conversation with him where there's no other distraction. And a good example of that was this weekend when I was visiting him. There was another person in the room, probably about 20 feet away from me, but that person was having another conversation on her phone while I was trying to have a conversation with my father. So what my father heard was he was watching my mouth. He heard the tones coming out of my mouth, but he also heard this other conversation going on in the background. And I could tell by watching my father's facial expressions, he wasn't hearing what I was saying. When I say hearing, I'm saying he wasn't understanding what I was saying. So I had to stop
Because the two conversations to him were maybe mingled, like co-mingled, and he was hearing maybe parts of you and parts of her, that person.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, the environment plays a huge role in that. The other thing is you don't want to use big, long words when you're having a conversation with somebody who has a form of dementia or somebody who has hearing loss, especially somebody who's reading your lips, because they cannot comprehend those words that you're trying to say. You know, when we're talking just in general, we're using a lot of adverbs and adjectives to describe something. But for somebody who has dementia and for somebody who has hearing loss, you really have to simplify the words that you're going to use to explain things to them. And the other piece is, for me, I write them down. And for somebody with memory loss, you can also use a wipe-off board and write things down for them. Just because somebody has dementia doesn't mean they can't read.
And if they forget, then they have the written note, which they can read again and to remind themselves of the instructions that you gave them.
Yeah.
So I think that's so important because,
simple examples.
Yeah, you know, keep it simple. You know, that's a mantra that a lot of people are used to hearing. Keep it simple, but also keep it short. And I like what you said about keep it simple, but use simple words and shorter sentences to get your message across, because some people naturally maybe talk too fast. They say too many sentences at the same time, so by the time they're done, the person with dementia or the person hard of hearing doesn't really remember or can't piece it together. So I think these are great tips that you're giving to help caregivers to relate to their loved one. And some people, obviously, that have hearing loss, they can have more dementia too. Your dad's in the MCI, mild cognitive impairment stage, which may or may not lead into, you know, actual full-blown type of dementia. But nonetheless, there are people with dementia that have hearing loss and people with hearing loss that have dementia. So those tips and those challenges and the tips for those challenges really go hand in hand. And I think that it's so important, and you're so astute to realize that and to be able to portray that information, you know, related to your dad to the dementia. It's sort of mind-opening, Kay, that, you know, you're experiencing this and then helping caregivers through your caregiving with your dad and learning things through your dad to help other people. And I think that's wonderful. So how's your dad doing today? Is he living up there in the cold and everything? Is he doing okay with the isolation? I know you try to visit him as much as you can, but you guys are having some really bad snowstorms and things like that. Does he keep himself pretty busy?
I would say he's got a routine. You know, you can time your watch by what he does every day, which is good. I think that
yes.
Routine is very important with somebody with dementia. There is one thing, though, that I want to add when you asked how he's doing. You know, I like to keep in touch with him, but also I like to keep him safe and in this pandemic. So I tell a lot of family members, you know, I'd rather that, you know, you stay in touch with on social media. And here's what I mean by social media for him. So what all of my family members have, my close family members, his grandchildren and his, my brother and myself, et cetera, we all have what we call Facebook portals. I don't know if any of you are aware of that, but each one of us has one of those portals in our home. And so we're able to connect with my father on the portal. And what's great about that is it's so simple to use. And we have it set so when we call him, it lights up really bright in the room, and he knows that it's on. So all you have to do is get up, walk over, and touch one button, and, he can see us. So when
it's like answering a telephone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He can't hear us, but what we do is we write it down on a wipe-off board in dark black letters on a whiteboard, hold it up to the camera with simple questions. How are you doing today, Dad? Did you take your medication? What did you have to eat for lunch? And he can read those simple words, and he talks to us, but we communicate on the wipe-off pad.
Well, I think that's awesome because this portal, this Facebook portal you're talking about, I have not seen one, but it means that your dad doesn't have to have a regular computer and log on and figure out how to get to Facebook and maneuver all of that in order to communicate with you. I mean, you definitely made it simple for him.
Right. And remember, my father never used a phone because he was deaf. He couldn't talk on one, so he couldn't use one of these a phone anyways. So this really
that's amazing.
Communication. Yep.
So how do you get this Facebook portal? I mean, can you just order it off of Amazon?
Yep, you can. You could probably go to any electronics store and buy one. You can order it off of Amazon. You have to have a Facebook account. And then, I set it up so it's limited as to how many people can call him. So, but and the other thing with somebody who's deaf is, a lot of these electronic devices operate by voice now. The interesting piece of this is it won't work with my father telling it what to do. Because of his deafness, the tone in his voice doesn't trigger the electronic, like the iPad or Facebook portal to actually call. So in other words, a lot of us can sit back and say, call my daughter, and, immediately the Facebook portal would call somebody. But because of my father's deafness and his voice is very monotone, it doesn't work that way.
Gotcha. Well, that's really a great resource for caregivers to have if they're in a similar situation with dementia or hard of hearing. So thank you so much, Kay, for sharing your story, your personal story. Thank you for all your expertise. Unfortunately, we're about out of time, and so we have to end here, although I could probably talk to you forever. Thank you for being on the show. I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Well, thank you very much, Martha, and thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in today. It's been fun spending the last hour with you. We'll be back next week, next Tuesday, every Tuesday from 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time with another show of Caregiver Solutions Info. And I hope you join us and tell your friends and family because it really is a great resource. And don't forget, call or email for your free copy of the 36-hour day. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good night, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us for this week's Caregiver Solutions with Marcia Teal. Join us next week. as Marcia, who has 15 years of Alzheimer's disease and dementia care experience, brings you more needed information to help with the care of your loved one. This show can be seen again on caregiversolutions.info, and questions can be left on the site, which may be used on the program to help others. See you next week for more